Imagine stepping into the lavish yet treacherous world of medieval times, where the extravagance of royal courts collides with the specter of mortal danger lurking in every shadow. Picture a home with no running water and no bathroom. You want to urinate or defecate and you have to go outside to an outhouse, hot or cold, and sit there to do your business. In summer, you may have snakes or wasps to deal with. In the cold, the wind blows through and you freeze doing it. If you're smart, you have a slop jar, a pail, that you use in cold weather and then dump it out during the day. No running water means that you get to carry water from a well or stream into the house to wash with, cook with, and bathe with. Want hot water? Heat it on a wood stove, as much as you can at a time, and dump it into a freestanding tub and hope it stays warm until you get in. That tub may be made of wood or a fancy iron job, if you have money. Oh, and that wood has to be cut and carried in, too. Have you been wondering how people in the Middle Ages survived winter? Let's find out. Winter was a frightening time for many people. If there was a poor harvest, you could starve to death, and there was always the chance of contracting illnesses that could easily kill you, such as pneumonia. Add to that, the onset of the Little Ice Age from 1300 until about 1870, and it meant surviving much colder winters. Winter was the most dangerous time in the medieval calendar year. So, how did medieval people cope? European buildings were frequently built on top of earth mounds, which helped keep them warm. Most peasant cottages were poorly insulated and would be full of cold drafts made from wood wattle and daub. Instead of a central chimney, which would lose too much heat and leave the building exposed to the weather, a fire that served as both a source of heat and a cooking surface was frequently located in the center of the dwelling with ventilation holes in the roof. Naturally, this resulted in the peasants smelling like smoke as soot quickly accumulated, especially during the winter. There was occasionally a second story that could be accessed by a ladder and was used for storage. There would be beds and tables in the main area around the fire, and possibly a nearby area where livestock could be kept. The long narrow fire pits that the Scandinavian Vikings built were lined with stones that absorbed heat from the flames, and allowed it to be spread throughout the structure. Cattle would be protected during the winter months in the integrated byres of Viking longhouses. In addition to being kept as a source of food and Roma materials, cows, chickens, and pigs were also kept as a source of heat. However, there were consequences to exploiting animals for their added body heat. It implied that living indoors was noisy and congested. But if you were spooning a pig with a good fire blazing some Marvin Gaye, at least you wouldn't freeze to death. Safety was a major issue, and many homes burned down due to negligence. Stone structures are notoriously cold, and glass windows were only available to the wealthy. The Palace of Westminster in London was glazed during the winter of the 1230s so that the chamber might not be as windy as it used to be. While this did not address the issue of temperature, it did at least prevent any ice gusts from blowing through the structure. The cathedral windows on the island of Magnon in southern France were also plastered over during the winter months, leaving poorer inhabitants with no choice except to try to block the openings in their walls with paper or vegetation. Clothing. How did people stay warm in the dead of winter? A combination of both insulation and radiation were the best ways of keeping warm. Like us, they wore cloaks, scarves, boots and gloves, not the five-fingered kind we know, but a more mitten-like style. Homes were often smoky from a stone hearth fire that was ventilated by a hole in the roof. This provided warmth, but not the kind we would be accustomed to for such cold temperatures. Indoor heating wasn't exactly great, so many people wore their outer garments inside to keep warm. In other cold and drafty places, like churches, villagers often brought their own hand warmers to mass, hollow metal spheres that held hot coals. Wool was the favored fabric for clothing, but it was extremely itchy, so linen was worn underneath. Sweating would reduce the warmth of wool, so medieval people often removed layers when they perspired and then reapplied them when they cooled down. Peasants are believed to have lined their winter clothes with rabbit and lamb. Peasants could collect the pelts of the small game their lord allowed them to catch and process them to make warmer clothes. Sumptuary laws, however, were very clear on who could wear what according to their social standing. The 1363 English sumptuary law, for instance, only allowed lamb, rabbit, cat and fox furs for the wives and daughters of craftspeople and landowning peasants. Food. Winter sets in just after Michaelmas, September 29th, and lasted until Candlemas, February 2nd, when it became warm enough to till the land again. That's a long time, so for villagers, autumn was spent preserving the harvest for the hard months ahead. For the average person, pottage, a stew made up of boiled vegetables and grains, was a staple during the cold winter months. Everything went into the pot, including fruit if they had any, since it was considered unhealthy to eat the fruit raw. Foods commonly found in a villager's diet would include onions, peas, colewort, arugula or roquette, beans, lentils, and herbs, such as parsley. For protein, cheese and eggs, and some meat when they could get it, such as fatty bacon or salted pork, would be added to the pottage. For the well-to-do, meat, like mutton, and pigeon, along with butter, figs, cheese, grapes, red wine were prescribed to counter the phlegmy effects of winter. For protein, cheese and eggs and very occasionally meat were eaten. Blood sausage or black pudding, made from pig blood, were poor people's food together with salted bacon. The peasant's staple food was a dark bread made out of rye grain or more commonly, oats. The only sweet food they feasted on were the berries, nuts and honey that they collected from the woods. Besides butchery, which peasants performed for the wealthier classes, winter was synonymous with farm work for medieval peasants. The water from a river was usually dangerous to drink and the milk did not stay fresh for long, so the peasants consumed small ale which, when brewed, was a safe option. In France and Russia, people would sleep for many hours of the day when winter hit. A civil servant who was in Burgundy in the winter of 1844 wrote that the men they would spend their days in bed, packing their bodies tightly together in order to stay warm and to eat less food. The citizens of the French Alps would hibernate with their cows and pigs during the winter months. A similar occurrence was taking place in Russia. The British Medical Journal reported in 1900 that peasants in the country's Pskov region would sleep for one half of the year. According to the report, once a day, the peasants would get up, eat a hard piece of bread, and take turns to make sure the fire keeping them warm was still lit. In the United States, the Sioux would survive the harsh winters in South Dakota by storing food like dried meat, corn, beans, and potatoes. The Great Famine. Of course, if there are no crops to harvest, no one can bring in the harvest. It was believed that famines in Europe happened roughly every 20 years. The Great Famine in 1315 to 1317 was the greatest of them. The harvests failed in the spring of 1315 due to extremely heavy rain, but this was only the beginning of the agony. As it looked as though the rains would never end, crop productivity decreased by up to a third, and animals perished from malnutrition and disease. Infanticide and cannibalism were two of the many crimes committed as a result of the calamity, and Europe did not entirely recover until 1322. The Black Death, which struck in the middle of the 14th century, was going to be more devastating, but the hunger, which afflicted up to 30 million people, killed millions. The deadliest natural disaster of the late Middle Ages was the Great Famine.